Hello everyone, today we're going to paint an oak tree, and I've started this painting already. What I've done is I've put down a layer of conventional acrylic paint, quite thinly, just to suggest a sky, some distant hills and something of a field. And I've done that to seal the surface of the paper and also just to give the tree that we're going to paint an environment to occupy. So having done that, I'm going to spray, this paint is completely dry. I'm now going to spray the paper with some water. And I'm switching to the interactive acrylic paints now. And I'm going to start with some ultramarine blue and a little touch of cadmium red to create a dark purple. And I'm keeping that paint fairly thin and using this onto the wet surface of the paper. You can see we can get these wonderful textures and we can start to block in the shape of the tree. Now when you do this, if you get these little splashes, these little dots of paint at the edge, that's absolutely fine. In fact, it's going to add to the illusion that this is a real tree. And similarly, when you block in the bulk of the tree here, you're going to get different thicknesses of paint and you're going to get little gaps of paint as well. And you want to keep those gaps, or at least some of them. And the different thicknesses of paint will help to create the illusion that you've got different layers of foliage and leaves, creating different levels of shadow. Now obviously the shape of the tree rather depends on the shape of the tree that you're referencing. But in general, I would say you want it to be about as wide as it is high. And then we need some indication of a tree trunk. And that's our first layer of paint down. But we'll perhaps just broaden the trunk as it meets the ground and introduce a suggestion of cast shadow as well. Next up, I've switched to, still with the ultramarine blue, but I've mixed that in with some yellow ochre, and that's given me a deep green. And I'm going to use this now to start to indicate some branches. And when you do this, you don't need to paint the entire branch, because what you want to do is create the illusion of branches just peeking through those leaves. So if you look at a tree, you know, it's certainly in the height of summer, it's rare that you can see an entire branch from beginning to end. And as I'm picking up more paint on my brush, I'm gradually increasing the amount of yellow ochre that I've got. And the lighter the paint is, I'm tending to put that onto the left-hand side. I'm going to make the right-hand side of this tree a little bit darker than the left. But we don't have to be too strict about that. And just kind of let your brush wander to a certain extent. Now I've changed to a mix of ultramarine blue and a little touch of cadmium yellow. And as you can see, I've just sprayed the painting with water again. And now, continuing with the same brush, I'm going to just gently feather this dark green over the blue that we put down earlier. And because I'm using the interactive paint, that's going to allow the paint to blend. So even though I'm applying just a single colour of green, that's going to mix with the different blues and purples that I put down earlier. So automatically I'm going to get a different range of colours and hues as I apply the paint. Now for the lower leaves, I'm keeping the brush strokes kind of sweeping downwards. But as I get nearer the top of the tree, I'm going to flick the bristles of the brush upwards. Going back in again, but this time with a bigger mix, with more cadmium yellow in the mix. So it's essentially the same green, but there's more cadmium yellow. And this time I didn't spray the painting with water. Some parts of the surface are still damp, and that's okay. But I don't want the paint to mix quite as readily, at least not over the whole tree, as it did before. But if I do pick up little watery bits here and there, that's okay. One of the things you want to try and create when you're painting plant life or nature is a sense of randomness, because that's the way nature is. Obviously, things grow in a myriad of different directions. And you can use the haphazard nature of watery paint to help you create that very efficiently. So I'm just picking up a little bit more yellow in the mix. And I'm putting that onto a 1-inch decorator's brush. And we'll start to tap in a different texture on this left-hand side. And with a little bit more yellow, we'll do the same again. And we can continue with that same technique on the other side of the tree, but using a darker mix of the blue, so a bigger proportion of the ultramarine, a darker mix of the green, a bigger proportion of the ultramarine blue. Really tap the brush down on the paper to get all these different textures. And if you want to mix that into some of the highlights we put down earlier while the paint is still wet, that will give you some nice mid-tones. And even pop a little bit down on the trunk. And in fact, what's happened there, that's quite nice. I've just lifted off a little bit of the interactive acrylic and it's showing the bright green underlayer. So that's quite a nice effect. But we'll use the same brush with a dry brush technique to put down some shadow. Now, to pick out highlights on the foliage, I've gone back to my lighter green with a larger proportion of cadmium yellow. But I have added just a touch of titanium white. Now, you don't want to overdo this. Don't put too much titanium white in, because you can always put more in if you find things aren't light enough. But generally speaking, you want to make your highlights bright, but not ridiculously so. And as the paint runs out on the brush and I work over to the right, that will naturally create weaker and weaker highlights in fewer and fewer places, which is what we would expect to see if the light is, for the most part, coming down from the upper left. For a few finishing touches on the trunk, I've mixed up that yellow ochre green I used before, but with a bit more white. And I'm just dragging the tips of the broad brush across the surface of the trunk to create some texture there. And while we've got this on our brush, we may as well use that to pop in a few areas where the branches are catching the light. We'll switch to the narrower brush actually, or the flat brush I should say. And I've gone back to my very dark green now and added a healthy dose of burnt umber to create some very dark shadows for the sections of branch that we pick out on the right hand side, and also in the middle of the trees as well, So what I'm going to do in just a second is stop painting, and I'm going to let the paint completely dry, because you can't gauge the full contrast and range of colours you've got until the paint is completely dry. So we'll see how that goes in just a second. Yeah, so let's leave that there, and then we'll come back in a few minutes when the paint is dry. Alright, well the painting's not completely dry, but it's close. And what I've realised is that I need a slightly brighter mid-green for the foliage. So to create that, I've just mixed up some cobalt blue and cadmium yellow. If you remember before, I was using ultramarine blue. And so using the same tips of the brush technique, I'm just going to apply this middle green selectively onto the foliage. And that's just going to give me, as I said, a mid-green. So before I very much had a yellowy highlights green and a very deep blue shadows green. I'm just adding a little bit more of the cobalt blue to that mix as I come over to the right of the tree. And that's giving me a green now, which is much more in keeping with what you would expect for the leaves of an oak tree. And while I've got that green on my brush, I'm going to use that to put a layer on top of this foreground grass as well. So let's just do that. So we'll scumble the brush across the foreground. And some of this grass can overlap the bottom edge of the cast shadow from the tree, and even bring it up over the top of the base of the trunk a little bit. And with a quick spray of the brush, we can just flick the edges of this interactive acrylic paint to give us some blades of grass. And a nice frayed edge to that foreground. And then finally a little touch of titanium white. And we'll just create a little bit of texture, a few distant flower heads. Just so that we don't have a solid block of green with no variation in our foreground. Okay, actually I've just had a thought. I can continue with those very light highlights just in a few places on the leaves of the tree. Just put a tiny couple in the shadow areas as well. So there might be some reflected light off of the grass. And then I've just added a touch of magenta to a pale green because I feel the need to just balance out the colours on this tree. So even though we think of a tree being green and yellowy, I feel we're very much in the blue end of the spectrum for this particular tree. So I just wanted to add a few bursts of this very pale orange, just to warm up the image a little bit. There we go. I think there's much more of a sense of summer now. We can continue that onto the grass as well. So, right, this time I am going to let the paint completely dry, and then I will give you a closer look. So here's a closer look at the finished painting. What I think I'll do for this particular painting is take some high-resolution photographs of close-ups of different regions of the picture, and then I'll pop those images up on my blog, so that if you want to, you can click the link in the description below, and then you can get a really close look at the different colours and textures and brushwork that I've used on different parts of the tree. Anyway, I hope you liked this video. If you did, please remember to hit the like button and leave me a comment below. If you're new here, please remember to subscribe to the channel and hit the notifications bell. Either way, I look forward to seeing you next Sunday for the next episode of The Sunday Art Show. Thanks very much for watching.